Oompa, loompa, doompa-dee-doo. I've got a perfect puzzle for you. Oompa, loompa, doompa-dee-dee. If you are wise, you'll listen to me.
While I'm perfectly aware that these days many people choose not to like many of his works, for those of us who do, we know that Roald Dahl was one of the most influential, unique and headstrong authors of all time. The Welsh-born Englishman of Scandinavian descent has made a massive effort to etch his name into the stone of history through his whiz-popping novels and mind-blowing wang-doodles. And to honour his work and the memory of all the things that he strived to achieve through his writing, I've decided to put together a list, through just my opinion only, of what I feel are the best of his children's literature. If you feel that you want to disagree with what I've put together, then that's perfectly fine. I do not consider this the dead centre list of what the best of his work is. But for those of you who are interested in seeing what's up here, then feel free to enjoy what I feel are the best of Roald Dahl's books in the children's area of his writing at the very least. Yes, believe it or not, Roald Dahl actually wrote more adult novels and screenplays to actual films and TV than you could possibly imagine. But that's a story for another day. For now, let's keep those vermicious canids and bizarre smoke-covered rhinos at bay, and let's indulge our ridiculous nostalgia to one of the greatest authors of all time.
Give me a kiss to build a dream on, and my imagination will thrive upon that kiss. Sweetheart, I ask no more than this.
Number 10.
To build a dream on.
SEO Drop. I'm keeping this one relatively low on the list since I actually don't think it's one of Roald Dahl's best stories, and the only thing that actually helped convince me to get it on here was the fantastic TV movie that came out earlier this month that helped remind me of the book's better qualities. The story about an elderly man who fawns for a woman who lives below him but is too shy to admit it, takes advantage of the woman's weakness for her pet tortoise and decides to lie, deceive and cheat her into loving him. Just like in real life love. Or at least that's how I've always viewed it. While on paper this story sounds like it should not be as heartwarming as it's intended to be, Dahl's strengths come from how he can take initially horrific circumstances, make you forget about the more grim context and see the situation through his eyes. And SEO Trot, while not being able to do that as effectively as some of the other stories on this list, does make you actually care about the main character, and while he is technically doing something that's wrong and immoral, his ingenuity, dedication, and the fact that he's very relatable does make this a worthwhile story. But what I like about this story is that if it were told more recently, it probably would have been told with much more younger characters. But the fact that Dahl chose to focus on more elderly ones is actually rather unique, and shows that love, even rather youthful infatuation, can still blossom in the winter of existence. That's actually quite a sweet and caring element to put in a story. Even though it does still all come back to how this is a rather worryingly dishonest relationship, but the heart is still there. But like I said, the TV film with the Hoff and Dame Judy was a stellar adaptation of the book, and it may be to the point where I actually consider this the best of Roald Dahl's adaptations from book to something more lively and emotion-based. And it may even actually warrant a full review one day, and I feel that this was one of the only ways you could actually improve a Roald Dahl story perfectly. So do please check out the TV adaptation with Dustin Hoffman and Judi Dench, because it's a prime example of how you can take this story and make it even better. But on its own, it's still a nice, enjoyable story that will make you proud to be short and slow. Number 9. George's Marvelous Medicine. What? This is another one that I'm keeping low for my own personal reasons, and while it is an enjoyable story in its own way, and had a great Jack and Nori retelling by the late great Rick Mayall, the story, I feel, is one of Dahl's darkest and more disturbing of his children's works. Now let me make something clear here. All of Roald Dahl's stories are very dark and disturbing in their own subtle way, but they tend to focus away from the more disturbing bits and focus more on the more fantastical and wondrous elements. or they'll happen in points where the heroes can overcome the power of the people that are causing the more disturbing element and then have their more greater element reign in as the more dominant force within the narrative. Here, though, the focus of a boy attempting to make magical potions for his abusive grandma does have its moments where it goes a bit too far in my opinion, particularly where it ends on such an ambiguous and abrupt note. That being said though, the book is still a lot of fun tapping into Dahl's twisted but enjoyable sense of morals, and having probably one of the most deserved punishments in the history of Dahl villains. Plus, one of Dahl's greatest repeated themes, that of the ingenuity and innocence of children, plays up very effectively here, and the story even has some homages to Alice in Wonderland at times, which is actually pretty cool. Although that does make me worried that Tim Burton will realise that and he'll try to do an adaptation of this as well. Tim, seriously, stay away from this book. It's already disturbing as enough as it is. We don't need your twisted sense of morals thrown into this one as well. Overall, an enjoyable little tale, just don't make anything from bottles that don't have labels. Seriously, did nobody think that that would cause disaster? Number 8. The Witches. One of Dahl's more heartwarming and surprisingly shocking tales, the story about a young boy who discovers a group of witches in the hotel with his dying grandma while on holiday, takes the two major elements from some of his previous books, such as the innocence and ingenuity of children over cruel and harsh adults, and the importance of the relationship between elderly and younger relatives, puts it all together into a story that is actually very enjoyable, though if I was to say anything more about it, I'd be giving too much away too soon. What I will say about this is that I realised something about this book, and subsequently most of Dahl's books, in that he seems to keep a lot of the innocence in his outlook on reading and writing as a child would, having the children be the hero and almost all adults be the villains, which is really a great thing for a children's writer to have and realise, but also impressive in what he went through in his earlier life. We'll get to that eventually. Plus, the book taps into a popular modern trope of the idea of certain government organisations, or even the whole government in general, being run by those who actually seek to twist our world and make us puppets of their goals, is very enjoyable to see in this book. And while it is a bit of a cliche now, Dahl does it in a very fun and creative new way that still makes it enjoyable even to this day. Although I think the existence of UKIP definitely proves that there are definitely some witches in Parliament these days. Although I think that the actual Conservative Party would be definitely against them, considering how their policies on pensioners work these days. And of course, the movie that came out about the book, while not being perfect, is still very enjoyable, particularly in the fact that virtually nothing from the book was changed when they transferred it over. Except the location for no real reason. But at the same time, you can't really fault a Roald Dahl story that has Rowan Atkinson in it.
One measly civil war in the entire history of England, and I'm on the wrong bloody side. I've assured him that he is as likely to be caught as a fox being chased by a pack of one-legged hunting tortoises. About as comfortable as can be expected for a man who's spending the winter in a blackcurrant bush.
Number 7. Fantastic Mr. Fox. I'm not going to mention the film in this situation because while it is a very enjoyable and funny film, despite a few borrowed plot elements, it has virtually nothing to do with the book. The thing that makes a book about a thieving vermin stealing from 3 farmers who are the very physical embodiment of sin, while having the ingenuity of a lower person over harsher people in greater positions of authority is still there, and being one of the few Dahl stories to feature animals as the main character rather than people, the thing that makes it great is that it's told from an almost refugee-style narrative. Once again being ironic given what Dahl did in his younger years. We follow the story almost entirely from the point of view of Fox and his family, and the intro monologue about Fox, while unfortunately succumbing to the informed attributes trope that Dahl does quite a bit, does still allow us to know that he is the one to root for, and we do that, even though what he is doing could morally be called into question several times. Though admittedly the villains are so cruel and hate-filled that you kind of enjoy it anyway. But when things go bad for Fox, he's almost willing to give up, until, in the very last hope, he sees a solution. And the way they really hammer in how these characters come from the brink of death to where they go by the end of the story really makes you cheer for them in that regard. And really makes this one of my favourites. Plus the fact that they were able to tell the entire story that goes through so many ups and downs within a novella length is really quite something impressive. That, and it gives us a fantastically catchy song to go along with it. Number 6. Matilda. While I know I'm going to have a bunch of people bashing down my door for not having this higher on the list, and while it is a fantastic story about the importance and greatness of books, in terms of it in its contrast to the other books by Dahl, it's probably the most generic of his, though that's still no bad thing. And the book is still one of his greatest trademarks, to the point where it's basically his logo now, and his child v adult, the importance of keeping imagination and innocence of a child into adulthood, and the abuse of guardian figures, which does make me wonder about Dahl's upbringing if he keeps putting those into his books. Was there something else about his past that we need to know about? I do feel though if Matilda really wanted to get her revenge, she should have taken a leaf out of this Matilda's book. We do still have all the things to enjoy about in a good Dahl story here. I just don't think it's one of his absolute greatest. And in terms of the live action movie by Danny DeVito, it is a very sensitive subject, I'm very well aware. So on that regard, I guess I can just say this. Number 5. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. By far the most famous book in the Dahl library, so I really don't feel there's any point in me going over the actual book and story itself, because everybody knows it. So instead, I'll discuss the 2 film versions of what I find good and bad about both of them. The original Gene Wilder version is still my more preferred of the 2, and while I will admit that I do agree with some of the criticism towards it and that it hasn't aged well, I gotta say that watching it is very much like watching the original Wizards of Oz, or an old Universal horror movie, or one of the old A films from the 1930s and 40s studio system era. They are dated, but the amount of effort on screen for what they're able to do for the time, and just the magic they create through their stories, their characters, the world they create, and the effects that are actually in front of the camera, really makes it quite enjoyable. In fact, some of the effects in the movie are actually still pretty impressive today, whereas others are... But I will say that the way they update the ending while still keeping true to the way it was in the original book was a superb adaptation, and actually does separate Wonka's true ambition from the fact that there are children potentially dying in his factory, whereas in the original book they seem to be one and the same thing. The Tim Burton version, I admit I loved when I first saw it as a child, and to this day there are still quite a few things I love about it, such as the backstory given to Wonka, the great music, the cinematography, and the fact that the chocolate river was actually a giant river of chocolate. In fact, there's actually a story that when they were shooting, one of the cameramen actually fell into it, and when he got out, him and his camera were both completely covered in chocolate. Though I'd keep that camera away from Augustus, or he'll end up looking like this. There's also that it has a lot more similarity to the book than it does in the previous version in a good way. However, Johnny Depp's very unnatural, confused, child molester way he plays Willy Wonka makes me cringe watching, particularly since it's nothing like the way Willy was in the books at all. And while yes, Gene Wilder had his creepy moments, he at the very least showed minor concern for the children being maimed in his factory, whereas Depp seems to revel in the idea of it. Seriously, people are potentially dying here. Why are you smiling like that? You're gonna get sued! In fact, I'm surprised that you didn't. Then again, I wouldn't really question the moral and mental standing of a man who thinks that this is a good way to open a chocolate factory.
Willy Wonka, the amazing chocolatier. Willy Wonka.
And some of the other casting decisions were not particularly great ones either. And lastly, while I'm always in favour of people changing around the stories of Dahl, sometimes they take it a bit too far. and the new ending, whilst having some heartwarming moments, is rather confusing and leaves you not with a particular feeling of joy like the original did. Despite my opinions, they're two fantastic adaptations of a great story, and scoffing down those scrumdiddlyumptious bars whilst watching both of them is a treat that I always enjoy. Number 4, James and the Giant Peach. Yet another one of his most well-known and beloved classics, and in a way, when you think about it, one of his most creative and weird of the lot. I mean, just think about it for a minute. A homeless Time Lord gives an impoverished kid who lives with his abusive aunts, another dull story with harsh guardians, a bag of luminous pasta that he intends to eat, but then he loses and makes a peach and its inhabitants go into giant versions of themselves, and they escape the living hell by rolling down the hill in the peach, which they then sail to America by powering it by seagulls, and then they have to fight off pirates, birds, hail men, and a giant rhino. Who comes up with a story like that? Roald Dahl, of course. The story encompasses many of the great Dahl elements that we've seen before, like the power of childish innocence over adult cynicism again, journey and dreaming of a greater life and land to reach, and death. Lots and lots of death. Okay, maybe not that much death, but there is a lot of implied death going on in this book. And of course, the book inspired a brilliant, if slightly weird, movie by Henry Selick. And I have to say, Miriam Margolyes and Joanna Lumley as Spike and Sponge, best casting ever. So with that, we can look back on this bizarrely imaginative book and enjoy it just as much as we had been before. Though I just really wish it didn't break the Randy Newman egg. Number 3, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. The sleeper on this list, and while this one's only mostly known by very hardcore Dahl fans, I feel that this very underappreciated sequel to the beloved classic is actually even better than the original. And while nothing will ever top the magic of the original, in terms of story and character development, the book does a great job in bringing the miracles that Wonka can do into greater light, to the point where I wonder if he actually is supposed to be God. I mean, he manages to turn an old person into a baby, make them touch the ceiling and the floor at the same time, and meet things that even Captain Kirk would question the existence of. There's also greater development towards the grandparent characters that previously had little to no lines in the original book, particularly Grandpa George, who was always my favourite. What? And even inspired Grandpa George's incarnation in the Burton version. But, and most importantly here, it brings the stories of Dahl into space! Overall, while the original will be more beloved, and rightfully so, for us die-hard fans, this little obscure piece of Dahlness will be revered and cherished always. Now if only someone could make a film version of this one. Seriously, Tim, just think about it. It's Dahl in space. How could you turn that down? Number 2. The BFG. Oh, now, who doesn't love the BFG? Moving on. The classic and heart-melting story about an orphaned girl who is mistakenly abducted by a giant friendly dreamweaver who decides to let her stay despite the fact that his country is full of even bigger giants that eat kids. Speaking of which, how is he called the big friendly giant if the other giants are big enough that they can pick him up in their one hand? And if they can, why don't they eat him? The giants from Giant Country taste of giant disappointment? Oh well, it doesn't really matter anyway, because that's not what the focus of the book is about. What is the focus is the relationship between BFG and Sophie, and it's one the best seen between adult and child, particularly since Dahl based the relationship in this book about the actual relationship with his own granddaughter Sophie. The theme of dreams really is a strong one here, since both the book and the highly underrated 1989 animated film have a feeling of a warm, childish dream, ranging from the kind and wondrous to the mysterious and frightening, and is arguably one of the darker of his longer novels, since it's very heavily implied that children are killed and eaten within the contents of the book's story. And this is a story where it's taken a lot more seriously than a story, say, like Jack and the Beanstalk, where it also happens. It's a pretty hardcore concept when you think about it. Either way, this story is a classic through and through, and while Dahl depicting the arguable avatar of himself as a dream maker is slightly pretentious and narcissistic, it does actually really sum up how much of a great writer he was. And let's just hope that with this upcoming Spielberg version that he'll be able to understand that. Although, I do predict that it'll more than likely just be Tom Hanks playing BFG and Ellen Page playing Sophie. Save yourselves now. Now many of you are probably wondering what could possibly top all of those. Well, hold on to your joysticks because we're nosediving in right into number one. Number one! Going Solo.
If you think we're on the run.
Now many of you are probably wondering what this book actually is. Well, this is actually an autobiographical novel by Dahl, which is also a sequel to another one he did called Boy, Stories from Childhood, which involves his situations and experiences for when he was an RAF pilot. And unlike the novel Beware the Dog, this was actually done in a children's book style. Yes, this was actually sold as a children's book. Despite the flawed premise for a children's book, it actually worked. Damn well, in fact, to the point where I actually do consider it the best of Dahl's children's work. He puts all of his normal charm, humour and light-hearted outlook with a mix of slightly twisted morals into a story that's actually based on true events, horrific ones at that too, and for a writer to be able to do that shows a great amount of talent and skill. A prime example of how he does this is the part in the book which deals with an older African officer losing his hair, which is a dire thing within the culture there, but Dahl, mixing it with his own flair of what actually happened, manages to make it funny, endearing, and actually very entertaining. Plus, the story proves that you can sell an adult concept and story and experiences to kids, and it will be successful, especially when they have to do with things as amazing as this. The book takes us through so many highs, lows, adventures, experiences, cultures, countries, and all from the perspective of a really fascinating man. And once you're finished, you'll be able to understand where he got a lot of his outlooks and ideas for writing from. For example, the element of using ingenuity and innocence to overcome cruel and harsh authoritative figures, which now that you know that he was in WWI, that whole idea and concept might sound slightly familiar now, doesn't it? The idea of journey and fighting and dreaming for a better tomorrow is something that many people who were on the front lines had to face every day. And when you've got bullets flying past your head all day, all you can do is dream and keep fighting for a better tomorrow. And on that note, the fact that Dahl was able to keep the element of innocence and mischievous fun that he demonstrated in Boy and in his childhood in general, and keep in later life, at least in his children's writing, is very surprising and joyous to see from a man who had to face so much that could have sucked all of that out of him, showing how much Dahl understood the elements and magic within a child's mind so well that he cherished all this knowledge so much that he could never truly let it go. And that, to me, gives this the distinction of being the greatest Roald Dahl children's story ever. And that was my top 10 list of best Roald Dahl children's stories. I hope you enjoyed this list, and if you feel if I left out any good ones such as Giraffe, Finger, Danny, Crocodile, Rhymes, Fairy Tales and so forth, or if you feel you just have any disagreements or anything else to add on what I said, then please feel free to leave your 2 cents in the comment section below or using this link. And with that, I bid you people adieu, and I'll see you again soon.
Away from the crowd, where nothing is louder than that.
could